So with that, I would like to be able to open our opening session with a technology executive from the Fortune 500. And I'm really pleased to be joined shortly by Paul Beswick, Global Chief Information Officer for Marsh McLennan. Paul manages over 5,000 technologists and a substantial IT budget within his company. But more than that, is a really leading mind, I find, when thinking about how generative AI works inside of large enterprise organizations. Paul, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Hey Dev, great to be here.
Excellent. Now, Paul, I think a lot of folks in generative AI see flashy LLM demos coming out of Silicon Valley, but MMC is not your typical generative AI startup. You're a massive organization. You have 120 years of history building at large scale. And one thing I noticed is when we met over the summer in Boston, even before you were officially a Preda-based customer, I noticed that the way you think about generative AI is different than a lot of the ways that other enterprises might. Can you share a bit about Marsh McLennan and what your philosophy is about Marsh McLennan's approach to generative AI projects?
Sure. So for those who don't know Marsh McLennan, and many won't because it's a business-to-business organization for the most part, we're an organization of about 90,000 people globally. We operate in over 130 countries. We work in areas like insurance and reinsurance broking, health, wealth and career consulting and investment. And actually, the company I spent, which is a management consulting firm, I came in about 4 years ago to run the technology organization globally. And as you said, we have about 5,000 people in that organization around the world. Our GenAI journey has been an interesting and fun one. One of the things about this technology is it's so immediately powerful and accessible that it becomes very clear and became very clear early last year that there was going to be a huge amount of value here. And we needed to be on top of it as a technology organization. Often when new technology comes along, you're waiting to be asked to do something with it by the rest of the organization. We took the view that the value here was going to be very clear. While there's been a lot to learn over that journey, we wanted to be out ahead of it. And so we started working quite early in 2023 on how we could make sure this capability was available to the organization. Probably around April, we had APIs available to anyone in the team that we'd made sure were secure. Around June, we put into pilot an LLM-based assistant, which we've been progressively building out from them. And then about 15 months ago, in August or September of 23, we launched that tool to the entirety of our organization globally. At the moment, we run at about 25 million requests a year through that tool, and it's used by everyone. I think 85 of the, or 87 of the 90,000 people we have globally have used that tool. So it's been a really interesting journey, sort of figuring out how, as the technology evolves, and it has evolved a lot over that period of time, we can take advantage of that and bring it into the hands of people around the organization to make them more productive and do it in a way that's really focused on just making their days a little bit easier, to make sure this potentially quite threatening technology is something that people really feel is an aid to the work that they do every day.
Paul, I find that organizations, especially enterprises, have many different approaches when they're deciding to pick a use case they want to start off with in generative AI. What's your approach? I've seen like use case audits, hackathons done internally. I've seen almost everything under the sun as people try and figure out where this could go. Been your approach to picking use cases that the team should prioritize or invest in? And like help us understand maybe like one or two use cases that you think have been particularly successful internally.
Yeah. So I'd say we've sort of done it backwards. My view is that the use case sweep is a little bit of a trap in a big corporation. And the reason for that is that the conversation that starts that way tends to be, here's a new technology, there should be some value from it. Let's go and do a sweep for use cases and figure out where that value is. But you're very much immediately in a project setup, steering committee, business case conversation right from the beginning. And the challenge with that for a technology where there was frankly so much uncertainty about where the value was going to show up is you're leaning into something that's pretty fuzzy and foggy. Now, the other thing I think we're finding is while the cumulative value of being able to bring this sort of technology to an organization like ours is huge, the value in any specific use case is typically tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. There aren't large numbers of things out there where you look at it and say the value is millions of dollars. If you're treating each one of those as an isolated project in a big organization, your entry price for a project ends up often being a few $100,000. So you immediately get into an ROI problem. Not only that, you're starting off with something that, like most business cases, has a pretty high likelihood of being a cost reduction play. So this exciting new technology that everyone is sort of keen to experiment with and figure out how it plays comes in as a threat. And I think there's a little bit of an assumption that this is going to be job replacement rather than job augmentation. And there's certainly a fear that that's true in a lot of people. That's not a very fertile environment to do a lot of experimentation, a lot of learning, and then feel your way through the way this actually comes to play in an organization like ours for doing something that's never been done before because the technology is brand new.
And what's your view on that job replacement versus job augmentation practically inside of an organization? Do you think the generative AI is more likely to have an impact in one of the two ways?
I think certainly in the near term, it'll be predominantly job augmentation. There will be places where you do fundamentally change the automation frontier, and that will cause some degree of disruption, just in the way that it's a new tool for driving productivity. Driving productivity is a constant in any business, so there's always some degree of churn. It probably ups the pace a little bit. But the standard you have to hit, the level of accuracy you need to get to genuinely fully replace work is very different to the standard you need to get to make people much more efficient. So the balance in the short term is probably quite heavily biased towards augmentation. And I think we're feeling our way through this. We will see how this changes as new capabilities allow us to go after task automation. One of the things I'm sure we'll talk about in a sec is that as you get to the fine-tuned small models, um, that is a really great technology for going after automation of specific tasks because you really want to blow through the ceiling that you can get to with prompting, RAG, and large language models to continually drive improvement in those processes. But you have to be able to do it in a very cost-effective way, given the scale of the problem you're trying to solve.
That's actually a great place and where I wanted to go next. So I happen to recall that when Marsh McLennan first started poking around, I think, in the space and started going to front base in the spring, I remember our first conversation and thinking, you're actually very discerning about fine tuning and whether or not it has the ROI that the organization will actually need. There, I wouldn't say that you were adamant that it had to happen. You wanted to understand if there really was a journey that could make sense there. And I'm
Yep.
curious if you might be able to tell me a little bit about your thinking, maybe from the beginning of this year to the end of this year, on fine tuning its ROI and value, what role it's going to play in an organization like MMC.
Yeah, so I'd say very early on, I was pretty skeptical. And the reason I think was probably most related to mostly two things. One, it was more expensive to do than to take models out of the box. And there was so much low-hanging fruit available through prompting and RAG that it didn't feel like the place to be spending time. Secondly, it runs into a whole lot of operational complexities that I wanted to avoid. So the great advantage with bringing our data to a model through something like RAG is it's really easy to control who has what access to what data and where it's going to show up, because that matches the paradigm we're used to in terms of controlling access to data anyway. You start training it into models. Now it's in the model and you don't really know where it pops out. And so how do you manage the security? Well, the obvious answer to that is you start partitioning models for different groups of people. But now you're multiplying up the infrastructure that you need to use and the work you need to do to maintain it. And I was worried we were just going to blow up complexity without really needing to. And ultimately, you'd end up running a lot of duplicative infrastructure for running all of those models. And especially back then, there was so much other value to go after that it seemed like a waste of effort.
Tell me about a little bit about what your experience, maybe your thought process is now, because I think you're saying that was especially true back then. Tell me a little bit
Yeah,
about one, what you think now, and maybe how that plays into 2025. If I had to think about from our conversation, Marsh McLennan, about a year ago, I think the thought process was like, let's let 1,000 flowers potentially bloom. Let's, we can go ahead and run an experiment for the price of a coffee, in
yes.
terms of like an API usage. And that probably is the right way, actually, to be able to get started a year ago. But you're in a very different place today. Tell me a little bit about both how the view on fine tuning, what your view is kind of now, and how that
Yeah.
plays into your plans in 2025.
Yeah, so we've tried to build our approach to make experimentation cheap. We rent our models by the call. We haven't gone and built or tried to host large language models ourselves. Not worth the effort right now. The way we've created the tools we give to our colleagues are designed to let them play around and figure out their own ways to create value. What we do across this organization is too diffuse and diverse for us to be able to capture all the different ways people want to use models. And then when we see trends, we build enabling capabilities to sort of take advantage of those trends. But but the end result of that is that what you see is a high level of improved productivity, but in a very diffuse and scattered way. Yeah, we think we've saved, and this is a very conservative assumption in my view, at least 1 million hours a year over the last year through the stuff that we've done around the organization. But that's mostly come back in better client service, some slightly better decision making, probably better work-life balance, all of those things. As you start going after more of the automation plays, you can get something that's okay out of the box and gets a process started, but you're always trying to improve the way that you're automating or you're making decisions as part of those processes. We want to get further than that. And that I think is where the fine tuning play has a lot of value. My hang up has been that if I end up having to fine tune a model or take a distilled model or whatever it might be for every one of those use cases, I've basically got the entry price of one piece of infrastructure required to run that one model over the course of a year for every individual use case that I put it against. And so I just couldn't see how the scaling economics worked. Because by the time you're right down in the detail and you're really focusing on how to make that step in that process better, you're after, tens of thousands of dollars or maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. I can't afford to spend 30K per year on every one of those things. And what I saw with Predabase and the LoRa based approach suddenly completely changed that paradigm. Right, the fact that I could now share the infrastructure, so I didn't have to worry about making sure every place I was trying to do fine tuning had the demand to justify the infrastructure, completely changed the economics and got it back to something where the entry point was very, very low. Um, I was probably most worried about run, but what I think's also been pleasantly surprising is just how efficient train is as well. Because we're ending up spending $20 to run a training cycle on some of this sort of stuff. With all the horror stories that you hear about how much people have spent to train their own internal models, $20 feels great. And we are seeing, as anticipated, good response times, and we're seeing accuracy that exceeds GPT-4. That's a pretty good outcome from my perspective.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I remember again when we were speaking in March, there was like three things that were hangups. One, is it going to be difficult? Now I need to get my team to wrangle this infrastructure. Two, what are the economics and unit economics for this to go forward? Which I think where Lorax was very relevant.
Yep.
And then three, yes, like, is this going to be something that can be scalable inside the organization? Tell me a little bit about next year. We've talked about automation use cases. We've talked a little bit about how there's a lot of low-hanging fruit at the beginning of this year using these models out of the box with prompt engineering. But now your use cases are driving quite a bit of volume and traffic today. People are, over conservatively 1 million hours saved is an incredible feat. You're going to have a lot more, I think, happening next year. What is
Yeah.
the direct, what's changing in the way that generative AI is going to happen at Marsh McLennan next year versus maybe what happened over the past year?
Yeah, I think we're probably going to see a couple of main things. We will continue to enhance the productivity suite we've built. The way it integrates into the Office suite, the basic capabilities of the tool. We've got a set of surrounding helper applications that are AI powered that sit around our core suite as well. So that work will continue. Um, but I think the big push for next year is really looking at how, as we go through a lot of the work we do, we can make a meaningful difference to efficiency in a much more direct way. And it's going to be lots of process by process, task by task work to figure out how that work can be done more efficiently, and the less interesting parts of the job can be automated away, so people can focus on where they really add a lot of value to those processes. So that very much gets us at much more specific, much more targeted work. Um, so that's going to be one part of it. The other thing is, I think we're starting to see that fragmenting the models and making them more specialized for some of the subtasks that actually happen in the background has quite a lot of value. I was at reInvent last week and I was listening to a lot of the stuff from the keynotes. Someone from Apple was talking in Matt Garman's keynote about the models that they have and how actually quite narrowly targeted they are. I thought that was very interesting, and I can see getting things that are really good at individual tasks and bringing them to play in the right places will be high value for us. So I think we're going to see that kind of thing as well. We've done, as you know, working with you guys, we've established the baseline of demand. I think pretty much all of our tool selection calls and our main tool are now run through the small fine-tune model. So we're putting in probably 500,000 requests a week now, and it's working great. But I think that's a baseline off which we'll grow, and we'll start to get into more and more specialized use cases. So I see a sort of a path for automation in a lot of places where we will probably go in first with LLMs and prompting to get things started and get a process working that has very quick value. And as we gather data about what's accurate and what's not, we'll feed that into a fine-tuning process to switch out the models for things that are tuned, which cuts our cost and gives us a higher ceiling in terms of the accuracy level we can drive for over time. So
Yeah.
that's sort of what I see happening next year.
And we often talk about that internally as this flywheel concept in particular. Paul, I'm going to
Yeah.
end with maybe one last question, which is really intended for the audience, to the aspiring entrepreneurs and other founders that are part of the audience today. Tell us a little bit about like a Gen AI feature or tool that you wish existed, you haven't yet found a good solution for. I was actually baffled to just see how broad your remit was directly inside of MMC, and I'm curious if there's a gap you think hasn't been well filled by any of the tools you found today. You're going to inspire the next
I've got
generation of founders is my goal with this question.
I've got a bunch of my team on the call. I can see from some of the chat, and I think they probably know most of the ideas I've had. I've already thrown over to them to try and start building. Um, so I'm not sure what the next one is, but I do think if we could automate that sort of self-bootstrapping process of getting started, distilling, tuning, and manage that whole life cycle that starts not just within one model, but starts outside of, starts in sort of one place and ends up driving you to another. That would be pretty interesting for me. I can see that being a very repeatable pattern.
Excellent. And I see that's where the industry is going kind of in the future as well. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. Paul Beswick, Global CIO of Marsh McLennan, really appreciated your time and kind of the continued partnership over the year.
Great. Thanks, Steph. Appreciate it.